So what are some of the resources or tools that attackers use not only to find control system or ICS OT assets that are exposed to the internet, but to break into them? And that's a big part of what we're going to be talking about in this section, really talking about these different specialized search engines. And so we'll talk about Shodan, definitely we'll get to that, but we'll talk about a few other tools before we get there, and some really cool and exciting ones that I've been working with that I wanted to make sure to share with everybody. So in this part, yeah, we're going to talk about these different types of specialized search engines, right? Moving beyond the world of Google and of course Bing and DuckDuckGo in the last section that we saw really didn't offer very much. So you can see a couple. We're going to talk about open infrastructure and open railway and the ICS Advisory Project and how these come into play into control system environments. And then we'll get to Shodan, which Shodan can still always be really fun and exciting to check out. And then there's some additional tools like Smap, which is a command line version that uses the free API for Shodan to do lookups, similar to using the Nmap syntax. Then I also have a version of that I had converted over using ChatGPT, or I just wrote it from scratch using ChatGPT. So you can use a paid API key if you have one of those. And then, and we'll talk about Censys as well, since Censys does scan a lot more ports on the internet than Shodan does. So Open Infrastructure Map, I learned about a couple years ago and was really excited when I come across this. Actually, it was probably, yeah, like literally probably a year and a half ago. It wasn't too long ago. And I was really shocked when I found it. I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I was really surprised that I had not come across it yet. And so the platform you can see was created by Russ Garrett, and it was taking the OpenStreetMap platform application slash database and taking that and adapting it to where you can look at a majority of the world and see where infrastructure, especially when we think of critical infrastructure, power, water, rail, right, those types of things, that we can see them on the map. And so it's really cool not just to play with to see, oh, okay, I can look in my neighborhood or my region and see what critical infrastructure is out there and exist, but then I can start thinking of, well, as I start finding assets on the internet through either Google, Shodan, or other sites, can I start figuring out potentially where these assets are connected, right? Can I tie in this PLC that I just found on the internet to a manufacturing facility or a power plant or a rail network, or and the list goes on and on and on. So you can check out their GitHub page that you can see there at the Open Infra Map repository. So opening up the Open Infrastructure Map in the browser, they actually just, as far as I know, they just changed this. So it has a little bit of a different look and feel when you start out zoomed out looking at the planet. But you can see the idea of all the different colored lines, the red, the purple, the blues, representing different infrastructure. And so we can, I'm going to just, because I'm in the United States and kind of go closer to home for me, we're going to come back over to my region of the world. So I live on the east coast of the United States in South Carolina, which is right here. And you can see we can continue to zoom in, and there's a lot that we can see. Now, typically, what you first come across are all the different power stations. And so we can start to see Columbia Energy Station, Wadri Station, McMeekin Station, right? The list goes on and on. I actually live up here, a lot closer to the mountains, so not too far away. We can see things like the Oconee Nuclear Station. That's maybe a 30-minute drive from where I live over here in Simpsonville, actually. But I think it's really fascinating. Not only do you get to look at infrastructure in your area, or I can go back to look at different projects that I've looked at, or worked on globally. But you can also use this again potentially to determine if you find ICS OT asset that's exposed to the internet. You could potentially map it to one of these locations. And I've done this previously. Now, you can't do it all of the time. I would say it's probably less than 10% of the time that I've been successful tying in something like a PLC or an HMI to a site that would pop up in the open infrastructure map. But it is possible. And that's typically when you think you find something like a PLC or an HMI, or even it could be a Windows server or a Linux box, right? Depending on how it's labeled. So if we have an IP address that points to the Greenville area, and then it's labeled either a Coney nuclear station, or maybe just a Coney or a Coney power, or some variation, then you probably could tie those together, especially if you see that the IP address belonging to that asset maps out to this region or this area of the world. So you can make that logical conclusion. And I think there's a couple of cases, again, that I've had over time where you can definitely tie those together. But again, it's not often that you can do that either. So I don't want you to think that it's a very common occurrence. But if you look long enough, you'll definitely find a few of those instances for sure. Because you think administrators or operators, technicians, engineers, when they label those assets, a lot of them, right, they're trying to do the right thing and label them with enough information to give it meaning. And so, we might label that router as belonging to the Coney nuclear station, which makes sense, again, from the administration perspective, but it's giving attackers more information than we need to. And so keep that in the back of your mind, especially when we get to the Shodan section, because then it's not really even, well, what if we find these PLCs and HMIs in Shodan and tie them to these sites, which again, for me, it's one of those cool little fun things to do because I'm nerdy that way. But also, well, what happens if I just search for terms like nuclear or power station in Shodan? What else do we find out there in the world that exists that has been labeled and it's been exposed to the internet so Shodan finds it? So there's really those two different ways that we can look at it. So we'll look at going through that as we go through this part. But at a high level, you start to get an idea of what the open infrastructure map can be used for. Right? We can look in a geographic area. We can see the different infrastructure. Again, in this part, we're really starting with power, even though we can see others, which we're going to take a peek at in a second. And then we could even use this potentially to map out or determine where these ICS OT assets that we find on the internet could be out in the real world. And again, it's not like you can do that with every asset, but yeah, I've had probably, let's say, 5 to 10% of the time it works. Of course, so we can scroll through. Again, energy seems to be the default focus, but there's a couple of different options, right? want to, I can zoom in, I can zoom out. We can give them our location. I don't need to do that unless, you wanted to zoom in on where you are. Great. Now, if you click on key, this is where it's showing you if you're looking at energy infrastructure, then you can see, oh, this is what all the different color coding means. So we can see the amount of power that actually flows through the different power lines, right? Everything from like the smaller ones to the largest, right? And then we can see not only are they right showing us where these power plants or power stations are, but based off of the icon, you can actually see what type of power plant, right? Is it going to be oil and gas, nuclear, hydroelectric, right? Coal-based. The list goes on and on. I think there are a few of these icons that are kind of shared amongst different types if you start really picking through some of the examples. So it's not 100%, but I think they do a really good job, and you'll see that in some of the other types of sectors that we're going to look at, because we can go beyond just energy. So we'll look at those in a second. You can even see if they map out like locations of where wind turbines are or solar, installations. And it's really interesting, right? When you start to get into all of these different pieces, even just looking around your neighborhood, or again, I find it interesting. So not everybody necessarily does. Of course, we look at this not only from the defender perspective like ourselves, but what type of attacks, or how could attackers use this information against us, right? Because it's all great information for attackers to have. This is very similar to when we were talking about in the last section or two, that attackers breaking into environments like Volt Typhoon, breaking into the IT environments of critical infrastructure providers and in the OT networks as well, and stealing the GIS data. Remember that geographic data that shows us the layout of the plant, shows us down to looking at a pipe, you can see the individual welds on a pipe if that information is in the database, and even the name of the welder who actually put that weld in. That's how detailed that it can be. And then we can see, oh yeah, this is where the fiber connections come into the plant. So that's great for looking at some type of physical type of attack against the environment, let alone what if the control systems are in that database? Would you be able to go in and find those assets? Sometimes you could, sometimes that information just isn't there. I would say probably more often than not, it's not. But there's a lot you can see. And then as you zoom in, right, you'll actually start to see where a lot of the other parts of the key actually come into place. And you can see, in this case, right, smaller little energy providers. But again, I find it really, for me, I like playing with it, right? So that's how you can look at energy at a high level. One thing also, especially if you're a little bit new to looking at energy environments, one of the things I always like to talk about is, well, how much power does this facility produce? So it's really cool that they actually label these. So you can see the Cherokee County Cogan Power Plant is 101 megawatts, where the Broad River Energy Center is 985. So you can start to get an idea of how big or small these installations are as well from that perspective. So I thought it was really cool that they actually add the size essentially of these plants. So which is very cool. Now if I click on that bottom icon for layers, now you can see where it defaults to power. But if you want, you can add or remove solar generation, telecoms, oil and gas, and water. Right? Water's a big one, even though it's vastly underrated. Right? It's just not one of those areas of control system cybersecurity that gets a lot of attention. It's gotten more since the end of 2023 when the Cyber Avengers, the Iranian hacktivist group, were targeting those PLCs that were exposed to the internet. And we had talked about those in the beginning of the course. But a lot of that initial push to protect water is already fading away, unfortunately. But here you can see when we switch over to water, oh, here's the Gaffney water treatment plant, right? So you can actually see these different environments and where they sit. This is definitely one of those, if you're finding, let's say, a PLC on the internet, and it might be potentially labeled that with a name, you could potentially look up and find that facility on the map itself and know exactly where it is. Of course, once you find a facility here, then the really cool thing also, especially again, whether it's from a defender or an attacker perspective, if we just go over, especially I would probably switch over to Google Maps and switch to the satellite view and then be able to get the physical layout of that facility, right? Get that bird's eye view. But this is the idea of the open infrastructure map, where you can go in and you can see water, power, right? Here's oil and gas. So I was actually, that's actually really interesting because I'm actually zoomed into one of the key terminals in the area for the Colonial Pipeline. Remember, the Colonial Pipeline was the pipeline that went down for 10 days a couple of years ago when ransomware operators, right, got into the IT environment, the back office at Colonial Pipeline's office, infected all the IT systems, and then they shut down the pipeline out of safety considerations. And depending on who you talk to, you know, that infection had also moved to the OT environment as well. And so it's interesting that popped up just randomly like that. But you can see those, right? Telecoms, right? So when you think of our ISPs. In this case, you might not even notice the changes, but if you look, it's, oh, what actually got changed or added were all these telecom towers, right? So especially when looking at Wi-Fi communication, so that got added. And then there's also, if you are interested in looking for solar generation, you can look at potentially some solar farms. And then we can zoom in here to see. What I'm going to do is click on power again. Yeah, and there you go. So you can see just by, if you're just showing the power layer, or the solar generation layer, it's just giving you those, I guess, those hot spots if you want, almost like a satellite image looking for, or thermal imaging looking for something. And so you can find out where the solar plants are, but you can't actually see what the solar plant is until you enable the power label, the power layer. So like, okay, that works. So now we know. So that's Open Infrastructure Map. Again, really cool resource. I was really happy that I found it. And we can look at it from the defender perspective and using it to see what's out there in the real world. And if we find assets on the internet, especially if they're labeled or we have GeoIP information, we can perhaps connect the dots there. But also, remember, attackers are doing the exact same thing. So if they're finding ICS OT assets on the internet and they're using labels and GeoIP information, they could potentially map it to one of these facilities. That's the whole point of this course, right? We're finding our exposures on the internet and then closing those before an attacker finds them and uses them against us. So going back to the slides, we can see, and you see the slides that just kind of provide the high level overview of Open Infrastructure Map. So again, we looked at power. In this case, I was looking at the first project that I had stepped foot on probably 13, 14 years ago was Greensville County Power Station, which you can kind of see down here. And there's again all the different keys for power. So I just put them on one screen, so it was nice to have to be able to see it like that. Here is where we're actually looking at Greensville County Station. And you can see it's over 1,700 megawatts. It's one of the largest power plants in the Western Hemisphere of its size. It's called the combined cycle power plant that uses water and natural gas to generate steam, and then it turns multiple sets of turbines to generate electricity. So you can see not only the power station, but you can see the substation right across the street, where actually feed those lines out to the public. It was interesting because we actually built Greensville County Power Station, you can see on this left-hand side, and we had actually built a previous power station that was just slightly smaller, literally just down the street. But if you look at them, one's Brunswick County and one's Greensville County, so they were completely two different counties. So it was really interesting, and how I guess all the political differences and just like going between two different counties that sit right next to each other. So OpenRailwayMap, which is another one that I had come across at the same time as open infrastructure, was, yes, as you can imagine, it focuses on rail. So let's jump over the browser and take a look. So here's the OpenRailwayMap. Again, it has a very similar look and feel to open infrastructure. Again, I'm going to look over at the US. So this is definitely where you can see the European rail system is much more evolved and mature than what we have in the United States. But you can see I can zoom in. In this case, we'll go back to, not the middle of the ocean. I don't think we have any railways there. Well, we can go back, and you can, as we start to zoom in this case back to South Carolina, you can start to see where those individual rail lines are. And we're somewhat limited on rail in the United States, again, compared to Europe in particularly. But you can start to see they get pretty detailed if you look at the key, because you can see not only, okay, here's the tracks, and then they break them down between individual, like a branch, or if it's a main line, high speed lines. We don't have a lot of high speed rail in the United States, so you can look at different stations, right, and then you can see those labeled, like we have GRV for Greenville, and then you can click through to see, we can look at the maximum speed, so you can look at the color coding there. You can look at the signaling and train protection. And this is where it gets interesting, or a tie-in to control systems, because all of this, like in the United States where we use PTC, or positive train control, this is where control systems comes into play. So the way I always think of PTC is, the classic example is talk about, well, what if a train is barreling down a rail track, and there's a turn coming up ahead that the train needs to slow down for, otherwise the train could go off the tracks, it could derail. And at that time, the engineer, right, unfortunately, right, they have let's say a heart attack, or they pass out for some reason, so they're unable to manually slow the train. Well, in this case with PTC, the train tracks are actually lined every once in a while with sensors, so it can determine how fast the train is going. And it can determine that if the train is going too fast for that curve that's coming up, it can slow down the train without manual intervention, so if something happens to the human operator or engineer. This is the idea of PTC at a high level. Europe has the same thing or the same idea, but it's the European Train Control System, or ETCS, which is what you see here. That's one of those tie-ins that we have to control systems and rail. You see there's electrification and then track gauge. So I started to do research. I started going down this rabbit hole one day, because where it starts to talk about like how wide or how thick, the actual rails are. And then got in this whole section of how and why they're so different in different areas or regions around the world. So it's really fascinating. So if you're more interested in digging into rail, definitely check out the OpenRailwayMap, because it actually has a lot of really interesting tidbits in there that you could get lost into. Again, if you get nerdy like that, like I do. So let's jump back to the slides. And just like with open infrastructure earlier, I just have some slides in there that show you, in this case, the different legends all put together on. And there actually is one other search engine, might be using the term a little loosely, but I did want to make sure that we built this into the course, because a big part of this course, as we've mentioned more than a few times, and you might get tired of me saying it, but it was to help us find our assets and other sensitive pieces of information that are exposed to the internet that attackers could use against us. And one of those things that attackers could use against us are vulnerabilities. Well, how do we know if there's vulnerabilities in different systems? And when we talk about control systems, so Dan Ritchie had put together the ICS Advisory Project, and he updates this every single day. And this is, you can tell, this is a true labor of love. And he's had to have put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this. And where he brings into one place all the vulnerability data associated with control systems, looking at it from all of these different aspects. And so, yes, you can look at the slide here, or we can just jump over. So you can see, here's the ICS Advisory Project page. And what you do is scroll down a little bit so you can see the entire dashboard. And if you scroll down further, you can see the link for looking at all the dashboards. But what you can see on what he calls the main view is you can see a list of the 3,000 plus control system vulnerability advisories. You can see those 3,021 advisories are associated with 578 vendors across over 2,300 products, which is, I think, a great way to show the information so we understand, well, how many vulnerabilities, or we should say known vulnerabilities, do we have advisories for? Right? How many vendors does that represent? And you'll see as we go along, most of these vulnerabilities are really wrapped up in, let's see, a dozen or two main vendors, especially though the top 10. And then across all these different products or product lines. And you can get more specific, and you can see then, based off of the vendor and their headquarters, right, who has the most vulnerabilities. You can see actually number one is from Germany, because the number one place or vendor for vulnerabilities and control systems is Siemens. And Siemens is based out of Germany. So that's why we see them. And then you can see United States, Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. And you can flip through those. But you can look at the bottom, I guess, half and see where there are the individual vulnerability advisories. You can see when they were released. So you see the last update was, this is 4 or 5 days ago since when I'm recording this. You can see the title of the advisory, which usually does a pretty good job of telling you what it's related to. Not always. I've gone through a lot of these, so not always, but usually. And then he does a great job, of course, breaking it out by vendor, which again is what he's tracking up here, right? The individual or the specific product, and then where that vendor's headquarters is located. So I think it's really fascinating. And there's different views. You can go up to the left-hand side here, and then so you can look at, don't necessarily like that big banner there. I'll have to mention that to him. But you can see here that now we're looking at all of those vulnerabilities, but based off of the associated risk level, right? The typical, is it critical? Is it high? Is it medium? Low? Remember, the critical vulnerabilities are the worst of the worst. And this is where an attacker could take complete control over that asset without really having any technical knowledge, and they probably just downloaded a free utility or script from the internet. So you have this huge amount of impact, yet the attacker doesn't really even need to know what they're doing, because they can just download a free tool to do this and have complete control over that asset. That's why it's critical. And then we drop down from there. So it's really interesting when you start looking at maybe that latest Rockwell automation vulnerability in Factory Talk. And you can see there's a critical vulnerability with two different CV entries. Remember those individual entries documenting individual vulnerabilities. And so we can see on a scale of 0 to 10, anything being, 10 being the absolute worst of the worst, of course, and anything in that 9 to 10 range is considered critical. And then you can dig in to get more information, because in control system vulnerabilities, this is where just because a system is vulnerable, it doesn't mean that we're going to patch it or update the firmware on that asset or make other changes right away. We have to sit down with the folks in the environment, like the engineers, the technicians, that can help us understand, well, what's really the impact of this system in the environment? What does it do? What does it control? If an attacker did get access to it, what could they do? How would an attacker get access to that asset? Right? There's a lot of other questions that come into consideration to really determine what is the true impact of the vulnerability in our specific environment, based off of where this particular asset and this particular vulnerability sit in the control systems network. And every environment is different. So you have to sit down with your team members and determine what the true risk is in your environment of that vulnerability. And I know this isn't a vulnerability management course, but again, going back to this whole concept, if we're using OSINT to find control systems that are exposed to the internet, and almost always when you find those assets, you're at least able to find the vendor, the make, the model of the device, and usually the firmware version running on it. So with those pieces of information, you can go to the ICS Advisory Project, or you could go to Google and look to see, are there any vulnerabilities that are known in this specific product running this specific version of firmware? Yes or no? And then it'll tell you whether there is a vulnerability, how bad that vulnerability could be if exploited by an attacker. And then you can determine what you need to do about it in your environment. Now, if you're finding it through OSINT, or that asset's exposed to the internet, and if we're talking control systems, it shouldn't be. So get it off the internet. And from that perspective, you've already reduced the risk substantially. But that's a great thing about the ICS Advisory Project. And we're not going to go into all the other dashboards, but you get the idea of not only getting an idea or an understanding of how many vulnerabilities are we talking about there for control systems, but also being able to map each of those vulnerabilities to that default risk level, but then also having to come back and look at that in our own environment with our people, with our team members, to really determine what the actual risk of this vulnerability is in our environment, and do we need to do something about it or not. But that's the ICS Advisory Project. So let's go jump back to the slides. Rest of this part is mostly going to be talking about Shodan. Realistically, Shodan is the one thing that I was talking about and doing examples, and then really wanted to build out a course around it. And that's how this course came into being. Because it wasn't just this focus on, okay, here's Shodan and we're done. It's actually a much bigger, broader conversation around OSINT. And so hopefully you've enjoyed the course. I'm assuming you are, especially if you're listening to this being a much later part. But when we look at Shodan, we use Shodan to find quote unquote things that are connected to the internet. When Jonathan Matherly started Shodan, it was all about essentially finding control systems. He wasn't worried about finding different web servers and indexing web pages like Google does. Now, do they do part of that? Sure, if they find an encrypted web page, they'll index the certificate for that. Or if they find a web interface of interest, like for a webcam, they're definitely going to index that because they see that cam is this, the camera is a thing connected to the internet. But it originally started as looking for control systems. And you'll see, actually, that's still reflected in the portal. The first thing you can actually find, or they have a listing for, is control systems. And I remember hearing, I think it was one of the first interviews that he had. It wasn't too long after Shodan had come out, was this idea. And there's really two parts to the conversation is, well, Shodan scanning hosts that are connected to the internet. And you can see this is back in 2009. So this was a really, I wouldn't even say necessarily gray area, especially if you were a company doing business in the United States. You're breaking the law, right? You're scanning these hosts that are connected to the internet without authorization. Now we fast forward to 2024, and at this point, to me, in a way, I think you're still technically breaking the law, but no one's going to come after you because there's 1,000,001 attackers out there also doing the same thing. So it's interesting, and I've always found that part interesting. But the whole point, or one of the points to the OSINT course, right, is this idea that we're using these resources that are available on the internet to use, either for free or low cost, and being able to log into Shodan and look at the information where they did all that scanning for us. We're not doing the scanning. We're not breaking the law. But Shodan has, right? It's like using dehashed. Right? We're not breaking into environments to steal usernames and passwords. We're just going to have I been pwned to look up, has an email address been compromised? And if so, then we go to dehash to find out, well, what was the password or password hash at the time it was breached? We're not doing the bad things. We're just using the information provided by those bad or now not so bad things. Wow. But we'll give this idea of with Shodan, and that Shodan, one thing to keep in mind, it doesn't scan all 65,535 TCP ports on the internet. It's only scanning a couple, I think it's like maybe 40, 50 ports these days. But it scans the commonly used ports. And so it does find a lot of things. It's just not looking at all the TCP ports. So it's not finding all of the things. Now, Censys is a platform that scans all the TCP ports. So if you're worried about missing something on one of these other ports, and you definitely could, right? It's something to consider. Then you could look at a platform like Censys, and we'll look at Censys before we wrap up. And then you can also, keep in mind that Shodan only scans very few actual UDP ports. So it's not even scanning a couple dozen. It's scanning just the common ones like 123 for network time protocol or 161 for SNMP, simple network management protocol, which we can also see on control systems. And so what you'll end up seeing though is that we're only scanning very few UDP ports, because when we scan UDP ports, there's no effective way of measuring in a quick or timely manner whether a port is open or not. In TCP, we have a three-way handshake, which we can base our decision on whether a port is open or not very, very, very quickly. With UDP, that three-way handshake doesn't exist, so we don't have a quick way to determine, hey, is this port or open? And it's definitely not reliable. So so Shodan will scan, again, 30, 40, 50 TCP ports, very few UDP ports, but that's it. Remember, there's 65,535 TCP ports that anybody could spin something up on. And there are technically 65,535 UDP ports. It's just impossible to be able to scan those reliably or in some type of timely manner. So we always focus on the TCP ports primarily, and a few known UDP ports like for network time protocol and SNMP. Now you can access Shodan at shodan.io. If you go to .com, the browsers will block you. You don't even have to have web filtering software. So apparently somebody had probably registered Shodan.com back in the day and had used it for malicious purposes. So even just the browsers like Microsoft Edge will block you by default. So now Shodan is not completely free for use. It does, and actually I should take a step back. So you can use Shodan for free. It is severely limited when you do that. You only get, I think, 2 pages of results, which it really equates to about 10 IP addresses. So it's pretty limited. Now you can see here's their pricing structure, and you can see there's the freelancer general account. This is the account that I have, and we'll talk about the cheat where you don't have to pay $69 a month for this. There's also, you can see small business and the corporate, which is now $1,100. I think this used to be $1,200, so it looks like they've come down a little bit. And when you look at the pricing, if you work for a company that can invest in these, that's great. But if you're doing this just mostly for personal use or maybe you're a consultant, right? Or in this case, the freelancer. What you can do is every year for 24 hours, Shodan has their Black Friday sale. It used to be on Black Friday, which is a day in the United States, which is the day after the Thanksgiving holiday, where companies or stores are known to put all of their products on huge sales. So that way they go from it's the point of the year where they go from being in the red, where they haven't made money or profit for the year, to when they're in the black, which means they're making a profit at that point. So that's hence the name Black Friday. So you can get one of these accounts for $5. $5 for a lifetime. It's not $5 a month. It's $5 period at the end, which is awesome. But you do have to catch it, and it's not always on Black Friday now. I think 1 year after COVID, they did it in the middle of the year, and I just randomly happened to catch it because I saw a LinkedIn post, and so I was able to at least get that out for some people, and actually did get accounts for all my team members at my day job. So that was great. So after all that whole long story, the idea is if you have, work pay for these accounts for you, awesome, great. Shodan is an incredible tool to be able to use, and it's it's worth it if you have that money. But I realize not everybody does. I wasn't gonna, pay $69 a month to use it, for personal use. But I was, lucky enough to get one of those $5 lifetime accounts. So keep an eye on those sales. So keep an eye on, their Twitter feed if you're on there, or LinkedIn, right? You can follow them there, and they'll announce it. So I do have some quick start guides for basically cheat sheets for Shodan, and you can find them on my GitHub. And there's a repository that not only has cheat sheets for Nmap, but for Shodan. And there's one for just general IT, and then there's one specific to control systems, ICS OT. And I put this together in part because it helps highlight some of the strategies that I've used to find control systems on the internet, but also some workarounds for, what if I don't have the $1,100-$1,200 enterprise account for Shodan, but I still want to use some of that functionality basically that's there. But again, I don't have the big account, I don't have the expensive account, and I don't have that functionality by default. That's okay. There's some ways around that. And that's what we'll actually look at, some examples as we go through the slides. And there's a couple of little gotchas that we'll also talk about as well, that I highlight them here, but they're not, I guess, highlighted that much to call attention to them. So we'll look. Here's the IT version. And I mentioned in the beginning of the course that Jason Haddix, right? I've always followed his recon work that he's done, and in his courses, he actually, I think I mentioned this in the beginning of the course, he actually was using this reference and said it was the best Shodan guide he's ever seen, which I thought was awesome. And then I saw the version he had in his slide, somebody else had put their name on it. So, c'est la vie. But it is still the best Shodan guide that Jason Haddix has ever seen, whether it was created by me or potentially somebody else after they stole it. Here's the slide. I forgot, actually, I put this in here. So it was really cool still to see it. Again, they didn't even change the color scheme or the values, right? Like the zip code is actually my old zip code where I lived in San Diego, and I think then, like, I was planning a trip to, if I remember right, New York, and so all the GeoIP coordinates in the cheat sheet are for the location of the Empire State Building, things like that. So very cool. And there you can see what one of Jason's PowerPoint slides looks like. So really, what are we trying to do with Shodan? And Shodan, right, we can jump in there, and we actually did start to touch on this a little bit, but let's go ahead and jump over to the browser and jump into Shodan. So here's Shodan, and they actually give you a little cheat sheet, which I found this was really fascinating because they actually based this off of my QuickStart guide. I was very, let's say, honored. They never said anything about it, but as soon as I put the QuickStart guide out, the original version showed up on their webpage, and you can even see the first thing they list is they're searching for the name of the city of San Diego. So I thought that was like the little tie-in. And then they had some of the same examples, and then they've kind of evolved it a little bit over time. So I always thought that was kind of interesting. So I'm kind of on the Shodan main page, kind of. So, but not really. So with the main page, though, when you go in there, and you can see there's in the upper left-hand corner, there's this Explore option. And if you go to Explore, this is what I was talking about earlier. The first thing that Shodan had focused on was finding control systems. If they used to actually have a picture on the main page of one of these, I think this is more like this mining environment and processing plant that on the main page, because again, that was really the main focus that that started Shodan. But the cool thing is that you can click on industrial control systems, and you can see there's some other great or options like databases, network infrastructure, video games, and door lock access controllers, right? And so on and so forth. But yeah, we're talking about control systems here. If we go to control systems, then you can see that what they're listing are commonly used protocols in control system environments that have been adapted over time to run on TCP/IP. So a lot of these protocols, originally they were standalone protocols. They didn't sit on TCP/IP. They were non-routable. You were only using them inside a control system environment. Where now, over time, because of the internet and everybody wanting to make networking easier and more approachable and easier to administer and manage, everything runs on TCP/IP now, just about. And so you can see the commonly used OT protocols like Modbus. Modbus is the most commonly used protocol still today. Some people love it, some people hate it. It's not great from a cybersecurity perspective. Not any of these are. and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you can see Modbus, Siemens S7, it's also very popular. DMP3, Tritium. I don't see a lot of Tritium, but BACnet. BACnet is used for the BAC, the building automation controls. So think of everything from elevators to door controls to heating, air conditioning, humidity. Ethernet IP is actually a big one I see, is even exposed to the internet. So we'll look at that. And the list goes on and on. I think that's about half the list you can see that they go through. And some of this is in the cheat sheets that I had put together as well for the control system, more specific version. But with Modbus, if I click on it, and this is where it gets a little tricky because I think Shodan's a little misleading here. Because if I click on Explore Modbus, it'll run a search for us. And it runs a search for TCP port 502. The problem with this, and you can see there's 717,881 assets running something on TCP port 502. And this is where, I clicked on Explore Modbus, and it took me, my gosh, there's all these Modbus assets connected to the internet. These are all control systems. No, they're not. Because this Shodan search, it only searches for any asset exposed to the internet that has TCP port 502 open. Remember, you can put anything you want on any port. You could run a web server on port 502. Or you might have an asset, maybe like a firewall, that sits there and it just makes it look like all of its ports are open. So you get a lot of garbage here. The vast majority of these 700,000 plus assets are not control system assets, and you're not looking at Modbus. There's a couple of things to look at here, though, that are really interesting. First, we'll just look at the left-hand side. So you can see total number of assets that meet the criteria for a search. Again, we're just saying, hey, does something have TCP port 502 open? Yes or no. We can see where they're located. So what country in the world. We can see who they're allocated to. And this is where really there's these 400,000 plus devices that are associated with Google. It's because a lot of these devices in the Google ranges are just showing like all their ports open basically. So you can immediately take off the list 442,000 and so on and so forth. You can see out of all of those exposed assets, you can see the top ports that are open and that they've mapped them to the applications running on those ports. So you can see 18,000 assets have open SSH exposed to the internet to allow someone to log in and administer the host. Like any host should not have a service, directly exposed to the internet unless it's a web page. That, I mean, that's its whole job, is to be exposed to the internet. But do I want OpenSSH exposed to the internet where someone can log in? No, we want to put that behind a VPN appliance at a bare minimum, multi-factor authentication to protect that remote access. And you can see things like, oh yeah, there's Microsoft IIS web servers, but there's also, VNC. There's more VNC instances to allow somebody to remotely log in than there are IIS web servers. IIS, if you're not familiar, that's the Microsoft web server that comes with Windows Server. Or Windows Desktop, you can run it there too. And then you can see the operating system, if it can guess or determine what the operating system is on those hosts. And so there's a lot of great information. It's really interesting to look at. Of course, what we're really getting to are these results on the right-hand side. As you can look at, oh, here's an IP address of an asset that meets the criteria of the search. And based off of the geo IP information, here's where it's located in the world. So remember, going back to the open infrastructure map, potentially we could correlate, right, an IP address and its geo IP information to the different locations or critical infrastructure sites in the open infra map, or even the open railway project. You can see the IP address, the company or the organization hosting the IP address, so you can see that association. And then Shodan, very similar if you're familiar with Nmap. Right? Nmap can test to see if a port's open or not. You can also do a service scan, which means Nmap, and Shodan does basically the same thing. Instead of just saying, hey, is the port open? Well, let me send some additional checks. Let me do some additional, essentially, queries. I'll send some strings to see if I can elicit some type of response. And by eliciting some type of response, I can find out more information about that asset. And so in this case, right, we pull back that information and then we can use that to determine a little bit better, like what's actually really running on this port. Because if I see something like this first host at 34.8.176.182 says no data return, that doesn't really help me. And it might have the port open, but it's just not communicating. So I'm not even going to bother or waste my time. The second one, a little bit more interesting. It says, sorry, that nickname format is invalid. Like, okay. So you're giving us a little bit something more to work with. Now, in this case, you can see Shodan has used a tag or a label where they've actually labeled this host a honeypot. So there's obviously a lot more going on with this host than just what we're seeing on port 502 to make it think that this is a honeypot. And a lot of the ones labeled honeypots that I've seen, yeah, they do definitely appear to be honeypots. You can see there's this cloud host for, again, no data return. I don't care. This is where you see these are all of those Google hosts that really are just junk for our purposes. Now where I get to 76.70.164.180, now this is where I start to see the types of responses I would expect to be coming from a control system over Modbus for a system like a PLC. So now it's like, oh, okay, this does look like a control system. And you see Shodan actually flagged it and said, hey, we're going to label it as ICS. Now you have to have the enterprise account to be able to run searches for ICS hosts. Again, we're going to find some ways you can kind of work around that, so you don't have to pay $1,100, $1,200 a month. But again, that default search, I love the idea, right? That we can go to this page. I can click on industrial control systems. I can look at all of the ICS OT protocols. And then I can click on that search. So, oh, yeah, show me Modbus. Or let's look at Siemens S7. And Siemens S7, it's the same thing. In this case, they're just doing a search for TCP port 102. They're not doing specific additional searches to determine, is S7 really running on this port? Just showing, hey, this asset has TCP port 102 open, and here's all of those Google hosts again. So again, it's all garbage. So the idea behind that the QuickStart guide is, how do you do additional searches or add additional things to search for to then actually find the control system assets, like in this case. And again, you can see Shodan's labeled at ICS. And based off of the additional text we got, you can see that Shodan was able to determine, hey, or it got information back. Basically, the banner saying, yeah, this is Siemens equipment. It's a PLC. Here's the type of PLC. You can even see the module we're communicating with. We can see the firmware version. Remember, the firmware version is important to have because we can use that to look up, well, are there any known vulnerabilities in this asset running this specific type of firmware? Because in control system environments, to patch an asset, typically we upgrade the firmware. And here's where we were mentioning earlier when we were talking about open infrastructure, was here's a place where they could actually put in the plant identification name. Now here they did the smart thing, at least, and they left it blank. I guess if you're going to expose something to the internet, the smart thing would be to leave it blank. Of course, the smartest thing would be not to expose it to the internet in the first place. But you get the idea. So we can understand the make, the model, the vendor, the firmware version to determine, hey, are there any known vulnerabilities in this? We even have the IP address. It looks like it's in Milan. So we could pull up open infrastructure to see, there's some type of tie-in. And then if we want, we can see further details. So if I click on the IP address, now we can see, hey, there's actually 2 ports that are open on this machine. So 102 for S7 and then 123, which that was on the UDP side. That's for network time protocol, which we were mentioning earlier. So we have this PLC with these 2 ports exposed to the internet. Again, is there anything here that could tell us what company or what site it's located at? On the surface, no. Right? If you're going further and seeing like this domain name, right, and looking at the host potentially, but then that's where you start doing active probing and scanning. And essentially at that point, right, without authorization, you're breaking the law, or at least it's unethical activity if you're in an area where it's not technically legal. So that's how I originally got started with really even control systems when Shodan had first come out. And this was right before Stuxnet, so it was kind of a perfect storm for me. But I remember going to the web page and logging in and going to that explore option. It looked just like it did back in the day. And going back and looking at, these different protocols, and Modbus was like, what is that? Right? It was, with S7, like we actually worked right next door to Siemens. So I, of course, very familiar with Siemens, but I had never heard of S7 before. So it was a great introduction for me. And I think it still can be for a lot of people, right? To learn those different types of protocols, which then also starts to get you into learning more about the assets, which gets you learning more about the environments, which then gets you into learning more about cybersecurity in those environments. So let's jump back to the slides. So we talked about the overview, or getting into Shodan, right? Looking at the explore features, so you could see, especially in this case, the different industrial control protocols. So it's a little misleading because you're just doing searches for specific ports associated with control protocols, and so it's not an exact science. So sometimes and people will talk about, oh, we see 500,000 control systems running Modbus on the internet. It's like, no, that's not the case. It's more like a tenth of that if we're even lucky. So regardless, right? Shodan is the one place that most people go to, right, to run queries against scans of the entire internet on a couple of dozen ports to see, are there control systems out there? Just remember, we're going to have to dig a little bit more than just clicking on Explore Modbus or Explore Siemens S7, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we're going to get into in the rest of this section. Now, before we get into a little bit more of the, digging deeper and running some more customized Shodan searches, we did want to talk about tags real quickly. Tags are really cool in Shodan. The only problem is if you want to search for them directly, like in this case, you can see if I'm running a search for, show me all of the systems that Shodan has identified and tagged as ICS, as control systems. You can run that search. The only problem is you have to have the most expensive account to be able to run those tag searches, right? So in this case, I couldn't run it. I don't have those. I just typed it in and made it look like I did, right? So the idea though is, sure, it's great if you have one of those more expensive enterprise accounts, right? That's awesome. For those of us that don't, right? Well, again, there's other ways that we can work around that. And so I don't think it's necessarily the end of the world per se if you don't have an enterprise account. Because Shodan gives us a lot of power to find things. Now, here's an example where you can see, and as we're starting to look at some of these examples, start thinking of the different Shodan queries that you can run to find these types of control system assets. Because here's a control system asset. It's a PLC that we found that's exposed to the internet. And you can see in the lower left-hand corner over here that, oh yeah, that Shodan's identified it and they've tagged it as ICS. And you can see this is in China. It has an IP address of 218.62.117.154. And then, as you start to get familiar with Shodan query results, right? When PLCs get queried, right, they have somewhat of a recognizable pattern. In this case, where we see the different unit IDs. And then in this case, we can even see that the asset shows itself as Schneider Electric, gives us the model number and probably the firmware version that it's running. And so we can, yes, look at the ICS tag. Again, if we had an enterprise account. But again, in this case, we don't have an enterprise account, but we can at least see when other assets are tagged as something. Right, and there are other types of tags that we'll see. But in this case, yeah, we can see that there was this device. Shodan, I think, recognizes it legitimately so as an industrial control system. In this case, yeah, it's a Schneider Electric PLC. It was actually interesting because when I went to Google that model, it's like, oh, I actually have this. In fact, this was my first educational LinkedIn post. So I thought it was pretty funny that I just randomly found this one PLC that was connected to the internet. And this was the first PLC that I had bought off of, and this actually came off of eBay, and it was supposed to be brand new. This is not brand new in any stretch of the imagination. So, of course, be forewarned. And not necessarily buy things off of eBay. But I thought it was pretty interesting. So another tag, which I find interesting, I think I mentioned this in a previous section, is that if Shodan sees a host that it determines is a honeypot, it'll tag it and let us know. Remember, a honeypot, if you're not familiar, is this idea. It's a system that was created to be attacked. And for ones that are exposed to the internet, really it's to learn how attackers break into systems. What do they do once they do? What do they use them for? And it's more for learning and research. I used to love really deploying my own honeypots, and this goes back 20 years ago in the early days of the internet, if you want, and where you would actually deploy a honeypot and you would see somebody connect and try to log in, and then you would watch to see what do they do afterwards. And what I found was pretty much all the attackers, they were coming from countries where pornography wasn't allowed, and they were logging into the honeypot that I had, and they're using it to access adult entertainment websites. So that's pretty much what it was for. No one was trying to hack into an online bank or try to break into any military or government installations. They just wanted to see porn. Right? So, but it was still interesting, right, to be able to watch other people and what they're doing, and I'm sure there are honeypots where you can watch people breaking into military and government installations and so on. If you deploy a honeypot internally, well then, if somebody hits your honeypot internally, then somebody's in your network doing something that they're not supposed to. Now, it could be somebody that maybe they just discovered there's a tool called Nmap and they can do a port scan of your internal network, and they decide to run it not knowing better, especially in control system environments. That idea, though, is that honeypot internally, you give it an IP address that should never be connected to. So if it does get connected to, if somebody pings it, if somebody port scans it, if somebody, maybe it's a Modbus honeypot and somebody tries to connect to it and read from the Modbus coils and registers, right? Read values off of the PLC. If any of that type of activity happens, then again, somebody's in the network doing something that they shouldn't, and it could be an attacker, or it could be like a PLC technician that just found out about Nmap and they're trying to run it. But it's this idea of what we call high fidelity alerts. It means with 100% certainty, right? Somebody's on the network doing something that they shouldn't be, and more than likely, it's probably some type of attack. So that's the beauty of honeypots, especially those that are set up internally, that they'll alert you if they're under attack. If they're connected to the internet on purpose, well, they're going to get attacked, right? So it's a little bit opposite thinking. The honeypots we attach to the internet, we expect to get attacked, right? We just want to watch to be able to learn, right, how attackers are breaking into that system and what are they using it for. Or you could put it out there just to see where the attackers are coming from. But internally, when we deploy them, that's where we're using them. Give them a static IP address that's not supposed to be in use. If it gets touched, if it's pinged, port scanned, if somebody connects to it on Modbus, somebody's in the environment doing something that they shouldn't. Again, 100% high fidelity. Now, this is what a honeypot tag looks like in Shodan. And in this case, the system is a dead giveaway, and that's why Shodan easily labeled this as a honeypot, because when you look at, that Shodan found a web server running on this host. It doesn't show us the port here, but let's say it's 80 or 443. But then you can start to look at basically what somebody had done when they set up the honeypot is they just said, turn on everything. Well, in this case, it turned on the honeypot features to make it look like this server was like 50 different web servers all at the same time. Which, that's a dead giveaway that, this is a honeypot, right? Web servers, legitimate web servers run one and only one type of web service, at least on a given port. So if I'm looking at this one port and I see 50 web services running on it, it's like, wait, that doesn't make sense. It's a honeypot. And you actually see a lot of these. So a lot of the honeypots out there are really poorly misconfigured, unfortunately. Of course, the ones that are really well configured, they won't be labeled as honeypots, right? They'll blend in, which is their real job. So when we mentioned earlier, it's really cool if you have an enterprise account and you can run a search for control system tags. But again, most of us don't have that as an option. So how do we find control systems on the internet through Shodan without having the ICS tags? And so we can run different queries, right? In previous sections, we talked about how to create specialized Google searches, right? And we looked at the Google hacking database. Well, in this case, it's kind of the same concept, right? It's just that we're creating our own Shodan queries. And this is where the ICS OT version of my QuickStart guide, or the cheat sheet for Shodan queries, comes into place. And this idea that we can run searches not only for TCP 502, but again, that's very generic. So we want to go ahead and look for search terms that help us narrow down to find control systems. Or in this case, we're just running a very generic search for a very generic term like SCADA. People used to talk about ICS and SCADA, and now it's pretty much ICS and OT. SCADA's kind of faded into the background, but it's a type of operational technology, it's a type of control system that's just particular where it works over a wide area link. And that's really the difference between SCADA and ICS. ICS is local, SCADA is wide area link, right? And we have lots of wide area links on the internet. So SCADA can definitely be a popular term that we see pop up on the internet. So we can jump back over the browser and we can run this search to see what actually comes up. So here we're back on Shodan, and we're just going to run a search for the word SCADA, for the term SCADA. And you can see what it's queuing in on is anywhere Shodan found an open port, and then it did those additional tests to get additional information back. And it sees the word SCADA, then it's going to, of course, index it and give us that result. So in this case, you can see the very first host. Right, we can see it's in Spain, and oh yeah, it looks like it found a web service, and that web service actually has this specific type of web server called SirCarLife SCADA version 4.3.1. And we can look that up, but the idea is that, okay, here we found a web server that has a page, we can do some research, and it could be software to help manage some type of industrial control system, and it's exposed to the internet. Could be another application just called SCADA randomly, but more than likely, right, it's related to control systems. The second result, you can see SCADA was in the result set somewhere. It's off the screen, but this is one of those honeypots where somebody just enabled everything, and Shodan said, yeah, nice try. You're trying to trick me. And then you can keep going down. Like in this case, we can see at 88.214.176.184, it's actually a Windows system that's named PT-SCADA-10. And it looks like this is picked up because, oh yeah, it's Microsoft SQL running on this server, maybe a data historian perhaps. It's exposed to the internet. And if it's not patched, this thing has been hacked 10 ways already. And so the attackers will have access to it. What if this is on the OT or the ICS network? Then the attackers have that foothold in the environment. Especially in this case, they're on a Windows box, and then they'll be able to move to all the other Windows machines very quickly in that OT environment. So that's one way, or one of those searches when you do something like SCADA. And so in this case, you can see and get the idea, right? That we don't have to have the ICS tags available to us to search by. We can just go in and run searches for different terms. Now, SCADA is a great example. It's very specific and it's 5 characters, so there's not a lot of confusing it with other SCADAs out there. Again, it's very, very specific. And when you get to something like OT, right, the characters OT or the letters OT, it can appear in a lot of places. So that's probably not going to help. ICS, same thing. You can try, and sometimes, yeah, some of the hits will be ICS related, but most of them, you could run a search and maybe it pops up in the word atomics, right? ATOMICS, right? Doesn't help. Same thing with IIoT. Sometimes you can find things related to the industrial Internet of Things. This is where we basically connect control systems to the internet. Now, one of the more specific types of searches that you can have really good luck is when you run searches for vendor names like Schneider, Rockwell, Siemens, or Allen Bradley, which, yes, got bought by Rockwell, but you still see Allen Bradley everywhere. So what happens if we want to run a search, let's say for Schneider Electric, and the more specific, if you have the full name, so much the better, I've found in a lot of control systems. So in this case, this is where you run a search for Schneider Electric, and you can see all these results. There's over 4,000 results where Shodan found an open port, did some additional queries, and in the responses, the system, like in this case, we're looking at mostly PLCs, responded back and said, "Oh yeah, I'm made by Schneider Electric." And so like that first host, you see at 2.143.141.120. You see it responds back. Here's that very specific kind of PLC format of the unit IDs. And just like we saw in that earlier example with that Schneider Electric that I had purchased off of off of eBay, you can see, oh yeah, it's telling us, yeah, it's Schneider Electric, right? Here's the model, and we can look that up. And you can just scroll through to get an idea of, all of the different pieces of information that you can find. As you start looking, there's some actually other interesting pieces of information, and you sort of see it on one of the earlier ones, but this one helps spell it out a little bit more clearly. Because you can see the project file that we use. Basically, it's the programming, the PLC logic that we load onto the PLC, right? It's programming, it's code that tells it what to do. You can actually see on what host it's stored and where it's stored. So it's actually in a folder on what appears to be a Windows machine, because it's C:\users /Mr. Systems /desktop /riv_dogwood.stu. So there's a couple things there, right? The name of the file could maybe give us an idea of what's there, but plus the idea is Mr. Systems is actually a user account on this Windows machine. So when we go back to the earlier sections, when we're looking for user accounts, we just found another user account for a system, right? That's on a network that's used to program PLCs. This is probably a Windows engineering workstation that someone will, like a PLC technician, will log into with an account, maybe named Mr. Systems, and use it to either do uploads of firmware or upload code changes. And those are saved out to these project files. And we can actually upload those changes to the PLC. So there's other pieces of information, really interesting pieces of information that we can find that are hidden away, right, through all these different Shodan results. If we go back, right, we can go ahead and do also something like Rockwell. Again, we would do like the entire Rockwell automation. That's the same thing where Shodan has found open ports, does those additional tests, gets the responses, and then lets us know where it saw Rockwell automation. In this case, you see it finds all of these Rockwell automation or these older Allen Bradley PLCs. These are actually the ones that we were looking at, and we found, for the most part, through Google earlier, right? Right, and it was connecting and mapping out the IP addresses and where they were in the world. These are the same ones. And so you can see, based off of the response, it's saying, yeah, I'm Rockwell Automation or these Allen Bradley PLCs. Right, here's my serial number. Yeah, I'm a programmable logic controller. Here's my internal IP address. And at the very top, we see the make and model. So we can look that up to understand. And I could probably connect to this remotely. Maybe it has like we saw earlier, a web interface. And I could use that to interact. Maybe it has Modbus exposed to the internet. And we could use that to interact with the PLC. So that's everything that we can see and get, in this case, over almost 7,000 of these by running a search just for the vendor name. So I just find that interesting. So we can jump back to the slides. So we get an idea that we can search for vendor names. We can search for the device type names like you see here. So we're just looking at, programmable logic controllers. Right, what about human management interface? DCS, distributed control system. And you can do different brand names. Those kind of can work sometimes, for sure. A little bit more limited. You can look for specific model types. That would definitely be something maybe an attacker is looking for if they know a specific asset and they have maybe an exploit or a way to exploit a vulnerability, like when we saw the cyber Avengers targeting all of those Unitronics devices. Remember the Iranian hacktivist group that was targeting those Israeli-made HMIs and PLCs that we saw in mostly water treatment facilities, and we saw the example in the brewery, right in the very first part of the course. But let's go back and look at, what if we do run a search for PLC? So here we run a search for a programmable logic controller all spread out, or all spelled out. And these were, the ones we were looking at earlier, right? That's probably how I even realized to maybe look for those. Or let's go ahead and do, human machine interface. Because you could try HMI, and HMI actually pulls up a few things. But here, right, it comes up and says, this is a human machine interface. Right? And it even gives you the product names. And you can see a lot of these are from Allen Bradley and Rockwell. If we look at one of these, like let's just pop into one of these, and you can see, here's some system. It has OpenVPN on it, though it looks like it's limited based off of the IP address, the source IP address of where we're coming from, which is good. We can see it hosts a web page, right? Some web service on port 7001. That's related to Digital Watchdog, and Spectrum, so that's probably to do with their ISP. But then we see Ethernet IP exposed, and this is where Shodan finds Ethernet IP and queries it both on TCP and UDP. This is where Ethernet IP is another one of those protocols that's very talkative, right? It wants to share lots of information about itself, and so it you can see in this case, this is a panel view plus 7 perf 1000, right? We can Google for that, right? Let's just jump over. I want to go to Google. I'm going to run a search. And then you can see, this is what we're looking at, right? You can even, nothing really exciting, right? Because it's just basically, here's the screen, right? Here's a little bit more of an example of what it would look like in the real world, actually displaying the HMI screen itself. Right? It's like interesting. So we can find these different types of control system assets. Because remember, this HMI, from an attacker perspective, right, it's just another control system on the OT network that could act as a foothold to get onto the OT network and access other systems. And then at the same time, an HMI does allow an operator to control and react to a process. And so it would also give them potentially control over the process that is controlled by and interacted with by the HMI. So this is where kind of come up with this idea of Shodan Dorks. I was thinking, oh yeah, we do this in Google. Right? It's the same concept. And again, we saw with Shodan, if we're doing the explore and looking for those basic searches, and we go to the page that lists all the industrial control protocols, and we just click on, oh yeah, explore Modbus, it gives us 50,000 results, but only 10% of those are actually Modbus. Right? Those are very generic searches. So we have to come up with more specific Shodan searches to be able to find actual control systems. So in this case, you can see, yeah, we're going to look for port 502, just like that default Modbus search. But then we're going to look for ID data, because that's a string that we see in a lot of like PLC responses. And then here you can see, we're also looking for a specific vendor like Delta Electronics. So we can jump back over and see what this actually looks like. So now that we're back over to Shodan, we run that search. And you can see, we find all instances of a service running on TCP 502, which could be Modbus, could be something completely different. But we also are running a search for that string ID data, and then in this case, the vendor Delta Electronics. And so this looks like, again, a bunch of PLCs, just slightly different nomenclature and verbiage that we use. You see, they use the term slave, which we're trying to move away from, but again, a lot of this equipment is extremely old and it's taking time. But it gives you this idea of how we can run a very specific query to find control systems out on the internet. And yes, Shodan, you can see, has these all tagged as ICS, but we didn't have to pay for a enterprise account. So we can make those Google specific searches, or Shodan Dorks if you want, to be able to find more specific types of systems that are exposed to the internet. And that's where ICSrank comes into place, which I think is really cool, because this is a project that you see Solomon, or Solomon's, we call him in the United States, but he had created ICSrank. Basically, it's these Shodan specific searches that you can just go through and click, and it'll go ahead and open up these searches and run them in Shodan for you, which is really cool. I actually was just on a podcast with him. He hosts the ICS Arabia podcast. And so we finally, after talking about Shodan stuff on LinkedIn for like the last year and a half, we actually finally got on a call. It was really cool to talk with him. And again, he pulled this project together, right, to make these different Shodan specific queries, or Shodan Dorks if you want, available. And this is ICSrank. And you can see, you can go, maybe we can look at those, maybe those Rockwells that we were trying to just look at, or maybe a micro logic 820, right? And you can see, he talks about what type of asset it is. In this case, right, it's a PLC, right? We can go ahead and just click on Shodan, or I'm going to open it up in a new tab so it won't lose this screen. And you can see it just runs that search in a Shodan for us. Really cool, right? You could be able to find these different types of assets. So I thought, it's really cool that you can go through and then you put all of that together and tracks them online. Right? And then I think we had talked about adding, it suggested adding some of those searches that we had used from the Elite Wolf project that we had talked about in the previous section, right? Where we were finding those different websites through Google, not necessarily Shodan. Again, that's ICSrank. Very cool project, and definitely check it out. So after we've talked about ICSrank, I want to mention and go back to the main Shodan page and look at a kind of subsection, right, or different page for Shodan where we can actually use a images search. So if you go to images.shodan.io, what you'll actually see, and let's just jump over there. So what you'll see there is anytime Shodan finds a service where taking a screenshot would show interesting information, like in this case, we see a bunch of remote desktop sessions. And we talked about this when we were looking at how do we find user accounts on systems using tools like Shodan and other open source intelligence tactics. So we can go to images.shodan.io and get all these screenshots. Now, again, what we're seeing mostly here is remote desktop sessions, which is great, right? Because we can use that to find systems with exposed remote desktop and understand user accounts for those systems. That's all great information to have as an attacker, a penetration tester, or us as defenders to realize, ooh, we need to get this machine off the internet so it doesn't have remote desktop installed or exposed to the internet. And we can scroll down and, oh, there's a webcam. It looks like there's actually two webcams there. One you really can't see. It's probably dark wherever that webcam is. And you can see this other one in the lower left just kind of looking at maybe a guard station or maybe like a pay station, for a parking lot, something. What we can do to get more interesting results, especially at level, we kind of want to get rid of the remote desktop sessions because we cover that in an early part. If you just limit the search to those findings over HTTP, which is going to be, of course, the vast majority of services that we have exposed to the internet. And so then you see any webcams that have been exposed to the internet that Shodan has found, and then it's going to go ahead and essentially index them for us. And so we can see, and it's very common, and this is one I've seen over time where you can kind of see this kind of middle picture is where, and I'll kind of zoom in a little bit. I think we actually, oh, there it is. It looks like, this is a construction site. So it's very common when you see new sites that are going to be built. People will put a camera out there so that they can watch it over the internet over time be built, right? Which is great. And you can use it for security, right? Make sure nobody's breaking in and stealing your supplies. And the only problem is sometimes these cameras stay around and they're actually sitting on this kind of almost non-existent network, but connected to the internet. And that over time, as that site is built up, and think of maybe it's a construction site and has a power plant that you're building, that camera then just gets migrated onto potentially what is the OT network. So over time, once that plant is up and running, this little camera that started out as just a way to watch the site being built and make sure nobody's coming on site and stealing your supplies during the construction phase. Now this camera is sitting on the OT network, or maybe in the IT network, but sometimes on the OT network in that case like a power plant. An attacker finds that from using Shodan over the internet, and that's that foothold that they have on the network. And that's where these can become extremely dangerous, right, to us from a ICS OT cybersecurity perspective. But it doesn't take too long as you even just flip through these pages, and I'll kind of zoom back out a little bit. But the idea is that you can go through these pages and you'll see kind of some common, scenarios for the use of CCTV, like watching what's going on inside of a store, or watching inside of, what's going on. Oh, this is actually pretty cool. It looks like maybe a conveyor belt for maybe some type of mining site moving off excess dirt once it's been washed, looking for gold. Maybe. That's kind of what it looks like at first glance. So there's kind of, you usually see a couple of interesting things. It's always scary when you see, cameras in kids' bedrooms. That's always like, I understand maybe a parent put that there to keep an eye on their kids, make sure they're okay, but they don't realize they're exposing that to everyone on the internet. Right? And you'll see different types of cameras set up to watch stores. I remember there was one time I found one that was set up in a bowling alley, and they must have had it rigged so that way if somebody was watching the camera, they knew, because there were like a bunch of people standing in front of the camera, and when they loaded it, they were actually waving, which I thought was pretty funny. So I thought that'd be a fun project. Now, one of the things that we also find hosted over HTTP on the web are not just webcams that could be hosted or located at an industrial site, but you'll also see HMIs. Now, these are becoming less and less, fewer and far between, right? Which is great from a cybersecurity perspective. It's kind of super boring from a, I want to look at Shodan and find HMIs and other industrial control systems, right? So it's boring from that perspective, but it's good to see that we're seeing less and less HMIs. You used to, even just in like 2023, you would open up Shodan in the images page and you'd find an HMI like within the first one or two pages. We've clicked through, I think, about so it shows us up top, right? Seven pages, and then finally we got to our first HMI. If we click on that, we can go into the specific Shodan findings for that host. And this is a you can see quite a few of these devices that get exposed to the internet. Now, there's a couple of things to realize here, but let's kind of take a step back. So one thing is, of course, we see where the device is located. Right? We can see it's associated with this Wabash telephone co-op. So that's probably just essentially the ISP. Right? We can see what ports are open on it. So we can see port 80, which is where we found the HMI over a web interface. And we see 1701 and 5900. And we'll look at those real quickly, especially that 5900, which is always the one that I'm always concerned with. But we can actually see that here's the HMI. So it looks like some type of process that we're watching over for taking probably out massive silos, because you can see like bin 1, bin 2, bin 3, bin 5, dry corn, or maybe they're super small. It's hard to tell, right? I think of big silos if I see circles, right? And then we can see the truck coming in, and we can, there's wheat bins as well. And then you can see kind of in the upper left-hand corner, right, where we're measuring things like the temperature, right, the humidity, right, and you can see, it's pretty cold wherever this is, right, and we can, if we're going based off of the geo IP data, right, there's a wet hopper for the corn. And so again, we have this HMI. Now this HMI, and you can see like right here would be a button we could push to go from on to auto, right? Where we could go into look at the alarm points. We could look at and maybe potentially even change the set points, remember the actual like settings or values themselves, right? We have these changes, or right click here to push to start. Do we really want this exposed to the internet where somebody could just start clicking things and causing issues? Of course not. Now, what you see here is this HMI is basically hidden behind this application called See More. So it basically makes the HMI accessible in a read-only format. So it's still not good that it's exposed to the internet, and this application or the appliance that the HMI sits behind could become compromised, and then the attacker would still have direct access to the HMI. So I still am never a fan of exposing HMIs to the internet, even if they're behind some type of application or device that makes them read-only. But at least it's not where somebody can just start clicking and potentially cause issues with the process. So you do find, though, these HMIs, and again, some are behind these devices that make them read-only. Some aren't. Some are there, and they, not that I sit there clicking things, but it looks like, or it would appear that they are fully interactive. And that's where, of course, we can get into trouble. 1701 over our UDP, not sure what they're looking for there, but when I see TCP59 for VNC, or VNC is very similar in many ways to remote desktop. It allows that remote connection to get you to a desktop, but it actually even puts you on the desktop itself, even if somebody is sitting there. And so it's even more so like you're sitting at the machine, whereas with remote desktop, you get a virtual session on that system. So you could, if somebody was logged into that box, and you could either watch through VNC or log in through VNC, right? You could sit there and actually watch what they're doing, which is always kind of interesting and fun in penetration tests. So I never want to see VNC and remote desktop, right? They're just, at the end of the day, they're services that allow somebody to connect to your system and have access if they have typically just a username and password. Sometimes with VNC, maybe it's just a password. Sometimes with VNC, there's bypasses, and I had used this one some time ago in a pen test, but these come up every once in a while, where VNC actually had a vulnerability in it where you would just tell it not to ask you for a password, and it didn't, which was crazy. Just say, oh yeah, don't ask me for a password, just log me in, and it did. Obviously, that got fixed over time and over the years, but you see those types of vulnerabilities, pop up. Right? And are there any vulnerabilities in this specific version of VNC that an attacker could use to get on this box? Probably. And so then I get concerned with, does an attacker have access to that HMI? Right? And is that HMI? Yeah, it's more than likely on the OT network. And could they compromise it? Could they use that to then take control over other aspects or other systems on the OT network? Yeah, probably. And so that's an example of one of those HMIs that we can find on the internet just by using the images search on Shodan. And here even it's just the fact that we can see the process and start to look at the process, reverse engineer the process. Probably not a lot of state adversaries coming after this site, but there still probably are definitely adversaries coming after this site. And that's what we have to be concerned with. So let's jump back to the slides real quick just to kind of rehash the images section. So we talked about, and we saw examples where you can use the images.shodan.io search to find remote desktop sessions. And that's a big part of what's there, right? We can find webcams, right? CCTV installations, and even HMIs. Those are really the three main things that you'll find on the images search, which is, again, I find it really interesting and fascinating. And if you've never seen an HMI, or if you want to start looking at, finding these HMIs and kind of getting a feel for what they look like and how they have these processes, kind of these 80s, 90s crazy graphics, right? To visualize the process and allow an operator to interact with it, to control it, and control systems. So it's always really fascinating, at least to me. Again, we saw examples of where you can find plenty of remote desktop sessions, and in this case, at least just a basic list of the user accounts that are on that system. So then all you need is a password to log in. Here were some examples of some of the CCTV feeds that I found over time. I always like the one on the left-hand side, because if you ever find an installation where it shows multiple cameras, right, I always find that really fascinating. In this case, it has, I don't know, like 30 cameras, and looks like they're all focused on different parts of roads, so maybe some type of road authority, watching for things like traffic and congestion, potentially. And then on the right-hand side, this is the one that I always go back to, because this is, again, a great example. Maybe this was a CCTV camera that was put in when they were building this water treatment facility. And then over time, it just stayed. Maybe it's on the IT network. Maybe it's on the OT network. In this case, it looks more like it's in the OT physical site area. And so it could be on the OT network. Again, an attacker finds the camera through Shodan. They could use it as a foothold onto the OT network to then take control over other assets in the environment. It's not too hard to get access to these cameras. It's usually fairly trivial. So those are some great examples, especially with the water treatment plant. Now, here's another example of another HMI. Again, it's another one where I just find it fascinating because if you don't get a lot of exposure to HMIs, you can go out and find a whole bunch. And you can see how some are very simplistic. I would say this is one of those that's probably a good balance between being simple but doing a good job of showing the process. And it actually has a lot of options, more than you'll see on some. So I think this is a really clean interface, at least from all the ones that I've seen. So I actually appreciated the work that they had put in here. But again, this is something that we want exposed to the internet for people to see in the first place? No, of course not. Let alone if it was exposed in some type of way where somebody from the internet could interact with it, right, and start clicking points and making changes. And on this slide, this is where we had looked at the ICS tag earlier that you have to have the expensive enterprise account with Shodan to be able to use. But in our case, if we're looking for those HMI interfaces, what we can do is you can actually, so you can run a search using screenshot.label :ICS. So it's like using the ICS tag, right, saying, show me everything labeled as ICS, and that you have a screenshot of, and show me the list. And it actually works. So you don't have to have the enterprise account to use essentially this ICS tag as long as it has a screenshot. I don't know if they've done this on purpose or they just didn't know, or if this might change. But for now, you can actually freely use this, which is really fun because if we jump over there, you can start to see, really quickly now where you don't have to dig through all those remote desktop sessions and webcams to get to the HMIs. So now that I run that search, you can see we have these different examples. In this case, the first one that pops up is basically this HMI panel interface, which is, again, I find it really interesting. And there's a login. It looks like this is in Polish. The second one, you can actually see that was the process that we were looking at earlier. And then as you can go through, now some of these might not necessarily look like HMIs right away. And sometimes what you'll find is that, like in this case, this is the remote desktop session. They just put a really funky, interesting background, which I kind of find funny. But remember, these are anytime it finds a screenshot on a system, a service it can screenshot, like remote desktop or a webcam or an HMI, right, that is on an asset tagged as ICS. So in this case, they have this asset probably tagged as ICS, but then also that they have a screenshot for it, and they're showing the remote desktop, not an actual HMI. So sometimes you see other things in here that aren't actual HMIs, or sometimes you might wonder, like in this, like what the heck is this for? But that's part of the fun of what you can find in Shodan. Right, here's a great example of one that it's behind one of those kind of read-only systems, but where you can see this looks like some type of water purification filtration system. So again, I think it's another great example of what we can find out there on the internet. And if we're thinking this from an attacker's perspective, right, how dangerous that can actually be. But that's how you can use the images search to find different control systems, as well as these cameras that might be on a control system network, and remote desktop sessions to Windows systems that are sitting on an OT network, or at least they're sitting on somebody's IT network that you could use as a pivot point into OT potentially. So the next part, as we start to wind this section down, is looking at Shodan with the command line option. And I like the idea of the command line to automate tasks, which is great. But also there's some additional tools or utilities that have been built up around essentially the Shodan command line, or the Shodan API, which allows this stuff to function. And so we're going to walk through some of these and really kind of as we wind down this part of the course. So if we look at, and I'll open up a command line, Kali Linux, just to show you what the Shodan command looks like. So if you just run Shodan from the terminal and hit enter, you can see you get the help. And so you can definitely do more research and to look into if these are a good fit for some of the projects that you're working on. But we're just going to look at some of the more common searches in this part of the course. And looking at, remember the whole point of using the command line is really to automate a lot of tasks, especially what if we want to automate searches in Shodan to continually check to see if we have any exposures for our organization. So we're continually checking Shodan maybe on a daily or maybe even an hourly basis. The one thing to keep in mind, though, remember Shodan, the results only are updated every 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 or so days, right? It's somewhere between a week or two. So it's not like even if you're running a search every hour, I mean, of course, once Shodan has those results, you'll get notified within an hour. But if you're really concerned with having external systems and exposures to the internet, you'll look at something like a more active, maybe vulnerability scanner that you would use out on the internet to scan your public IP facing ranges, right? To really do that more effectively. Because again, Shodan might not tell you for a week or two before you have an issue. Well, do you really want to wait a week or two to know that you have an issue? No. Right? So if you have that option, go purchase an internet hosted vulnerability scanner and use that to scan your public IP addresses or some type of attack surface management utility. But there's a few options you can see. Again, whether we set it up to automate and we want to get alerts, and Shodan actually also makes that available through the graphical interface. We can look at getting data for a specific domain. I actually have this in the slides, but you can do Shodan and then the name of the domain, and you can see we're just going to use netflix.com as the example. And just to get an idea of, here's all the hosts that Shodan is aware of, and you can see just a few, right, that Shodan is aware of from all of their scans across the internet. So you have quite a few different options. I would definitely drop these to pull out any unique records, whether you do that from the command line or copy them into something like a spreadsheet. But there's a lot of great data that you can have going back to what if we're looking for a host associated with a domain, right? And go back to the help file. The one thing that, if you're looking up for information about a specific host, then you have to type in, and I always wanted to try it like IP, but it's actually host, and then you type in the IP address. So here's an IP address of a host I just took at random for where we were just looking at the exposed HMIs, right? And we can run that search. Now, this one might be a little ugly at first, but what we're actually seeing is here's the IP address, right? Here's the host names that are associated with it based off of the digital certificate that's associated with the web interface on it. We can see the organization it's registered to. We can see where it's located in the US based off of geo IP information. You can see it has 2 open ports. It'd be nice if they showed us right there what the ports were, but we can keep scrolling down and it shows us in red, right? There's all these potential vulnerabilities associated with the service based off of the vendor, the make, and the version of the software or service that's running. Now we can see, here's the ports. And then it looks like, okay, so actually it looks like it's probably some type of Axis web camera that's exposed to the internet, right? And so if we jump back to Shodan, we can actually look at what this looks like in Shodan. And here's that host we were just looking at in Kali Linux at the command line. But here now we see it probably a little bit easier to read. But again, not as easy to automate these types of searches when we're using graphical interfaces. But you can see it looks like this is one that we have found out where it's like, oh, we had all these cameras. It almost looks like in some scary basement of a building. I don't know if it's for a horror movie or not, but you can actually see, oh yeah, there's all these different cameras again, and they have web interfaces, right? They're exposed to the internet. That's how they're being found by Shodan, and those web certificates actually have these names and whether they're associated with this domain. So, and we also can get an idea of where, in the world that these cameras exist. That's another really interesting thing that we can use the search for. There's a couple other, interesting tidbits. What you want to go for if you really want to dig into it is if you just go to cli.shodan.io. Then it'll show you everything from how do I install Shodan on the machine to those common types of queries. Like here you can see, oh, show me the count for how many Microsoft IIS 6.0 machines are on the internet. This page is probably a little old. Hopefully that number has dropped significantly by 2024 when I'm recording this, but maybe not. So let's go back to the slides. So here you can see the search that we had run earlier when we were looking for hosts associated with a specific domain name. Like in this case, right, all where Shodan is identified a host associated with Netflix.com, it indexes that information and shows us. And it had a substantial list. So here you can see it finds 2014 stock and roll dev 100.netflix.com, about.netflix.com, and then multiple IP addresses for those hosts. And you can remember that list that just scrolled on and on and on that we had when we ran it in Kali Linux. So you can run that to find hosts, kind of like when we were using DNS Dumpster, right, in one of the previous parts of the course. You can also, and this is one we didn't look at in Kali Linux, but I thought this was a really cool little trick. Another way to find additional hosts and maybe IP addresses, potentially subnets, and where you can do Shodan Search and then do an org, and then you do the \% and kind of put those around your domain name that you're looking for. It's almost like a wildcard. And then it helps even open up that search even further. So it's not just limited to host addresses for a domain, but here now you're seeing anything where it saw a mention of Netflix. And then there you saw, oh, we are seeing some new hosts because we get this really long kind of host name that ends in nflxvideo.net. It's like, is that associated with Netflix or not? Based off of this search, it appears to be, but we'll definitely want to do some additional research just to make sure. Right. So Shodan does index a lot of information, at least for, again, those services that it finds out on the internet. There's another example where you can do a search for a particular autonomous system number. Remember the ASN where we have that. So if we know the ASN for Netflix, then we can run that search. And I think that's partly what Netflix is doing in that organization search as well, and leveraging that ASN information. Right? And basically that's where we even see the same results. So ultimately, we've talked about a lot in this section, and we talked a lot about how we find systems, services, applications, vulnerabilities, control systems like PLCs and HMIs that are exposed to the internet. We've talked a lot about finding these types of assets, right? Exposed, finding those exposures exposed to the internet. So what we really want to focus on, though, is it's really interesting, yes, and fascinating from a research perspective to look at everything across the entire internet, right? Most definitely. Not as interesting as it used to be, right? We definitely don't see as much on the internet as we used to because of more and stronger cybersecurity practices out there for control system environments, which is great, which is what we all want. Right? It's just not as fascinating, right? When we look. But ultimately, it's, unless we're a researcher or we're just kind of screwing off or just, wasting a little time, looking at to see what's out there, right? In our day jobs, right, we want to focus on, does our environment or does one of my clients' environments have any exposures? So that's where we have to narrow the focus. Again, we're not going to just look for any HMI on the internet, but does my organization have an HMI or a PLC or any other sensitive systems or applications or services exposed to the internet? So that's where we can use the net command or the net search parameter in the Shodan search. So we can say net : and then here was one of the random subnets that we had seen earlier in the course from one of the IP address searches that we had done. So I can see, show me all of the results in the subnet 153.156.222.0. So there's up to 254 possible hosts there. And that's just for my organization. Again, I'm not worried about billions and billions of potential hosts on the internet. I'm just worried about my 254 potential IP addresses. Do I have any exposures there or not? Or again, maybe this is one of my clients. So if we jump back over to Shodan, you can see that there's 76 available hosts in this subnet of 153.156.222.0/24. So say that is our IP range that we have for our organization. Or you might even think maybe this is what we think is our IP address. I've worked with a lot of organizations and they think that maybe they have this entire IP address. Maybe they only have a part of it. I actually did a pen test one time where the client gave me an entire range. Part of the range wasn't theirs. And I ended up literally breaking into a casino. This goes back 15 years. So you definitely had to explain that, right? But compromising the firewall for a casino in Las Vegas, one of the big ones, because my client thought, it was their IP address, and they gave me authorization to attack that IP address. But at the end of the day, it wasn't an IP address that they owned or that they had responsibility for. So you want to look very carefully at IP addresses to see what's in those ranges, and potentially, right, are all of these your assets? But we can start to see, right, across those 76 assets in that range. You can see in the left-hand side, right, there's 12 web servers on port 80, and there's 12 web servers on port 443, which are probably the same boxes, just serving up the same page on 80 and 443. Or maybe 80 redirects to 443. But at least there's 12 web servers there. We can see 6 instances on 1723, probably for VPN. We can see 4 DNS servers on 53, or at least 4 services running on DNS or on port 53, which more than likely is for DNS. And then we see port 123, which on UDP, that's for NTP, the network time protocol, and so on and so forth. We can get an idea of, hey, there's a couple of FortiGate firewalls out there. We're probably finding those because their management interface could be exposed to the internet, which we never want to see because that could give the attacker the ability to log in, because usually to log in those systems, you need a username and a password. And we've seen, right, in just part of this course, how easy it is at times to get those usernames and passwords, let alone if they use maybe a default username and password and never changed it. Because that still happens today. But you can see what's out there. And again, we can understand, are there any vulnerabilities, right? Or are there any risks? Yeah, are there any risk with exposing the management interface for your firewall to the internet? Yeah, of course there are. So much, then, as you've gone through this course, you probably start to realize so much of this gets exposed to the internet. It's just because people, either don't understand the risk, or they just accidentally are exposing these things out on the internet. They're not thinking about it. I always, cringe when I think of the parent putting a webcam out on the internet because they want to see it from their phone, like when they're away from the house, or maybe they're upstairs in their bedroom and they just want to be able to check on their child, but they've opened it up to the entire internet. Of course, they probably didn't mean to do that, right? But it happened accidentally. So again, it happens in enterprises and ICS OT networks. We have to make sure. That's why we're searching for these vulnerabilities and these exposures. And we can take the time to go through the list to see, right, what's in our environment, right? Here's a webcam, right? It's for a solar farm. Okay, is this camera on the ICS OT network that would give me a foothold in that environment? So one of the tools, I found this watching Jason Haddix do his most recent recon workshop talking about Smap. So Smap is kind of this idea of using the command line to interact with Shodan, but to do just simple searches, but using also at the same time the format or the syntax structure of Nmap that a lot of people are already very familiar with. It's actually kind of cool. At first I was like, okay, I'm like, but you know what? I'll give it a try. And Jason Haddix gave it big props. So I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. And actually once I tried it, I was like, oh, this is really cool. Now the one thing that it's limited on is it takes advantage of the free API key. So it doesn't have the ability to put in an API key. And I fixed that. But it's using the free API key if you have a medium or large size environment. If you go to run a search of any size, it'll immediately suck up the amount of searches that they allow you to have with a free API key, which is not many, right? So I think I went to run a search against one of our very large IP address ranges at the office, and it had already locked out the free API in probably less than 2 seconds. So it was, if you're just doing one-offs and individual searches, it's great. It's a really cool tool. If you have an API key and you need to run more in-depth or longer searches, then you want to use the version that allows you to use the API key, which I just recreated with Shodan, and it probably took about half hour to recreate the entire thing. But it's a great tool that he had created. And so let's jump over to the command line. In this case, we can see real quickly on our way there, we can see here's the GitHub page. The really cool thing is you can go to his GitHub page and he has precompiled binaries. So whether so you can run it right away on Linux, you can run it right away on Windows. So here I've opened up my command prompts and we're looking at that webcam for that solar farm. So if I want, looks like a solar farm in Japan. So I want to go ahead and do a simple Nmap scan, but in this case, we're using Smap. Remember, we're not generating any packets to send to the target, right? In this case, the webcam, we're just searching Shodan. Shodan did the scanning for us, right? Shodan did the scanning, scans the internet, takes that data, puts it in a database, and then we can query that through the API. In this case, using Smap. So I can do Smap, and then I can do 153.156.222.92. If I run a search, it'll come back and you can see that it says, oh yeah, we found port 80 and port 81 open on this host. Now in this case, yes, it looks like it's Nmap results, right? They even put in starting Nmap 9.99, which isn't a real version, but so I don't know why it says Nmap. I would have it probably say Smap, not to confuse people, but you can get an idea. You can use this at a command line to get an idea of what hosts are up and what's there. Now in this case, the camera, there's no more information on these services. I have checked. But what we can do, well, just out of curiosity, how about we run a search for that entire subnet? just to see what's there. And again, it's just like as if we sat there running a search with Nmap and running scans. And you can see that some of these have additional pieces of information for those services accounts, right? And we can spot there's other hosts of interest, like here's a host that has things like Telnet exposed to the internet. Like, I wonder what that is. Or in this case, oh, here you can see this host, right, at 153.156.222.225 that, oh, it's running Citrix Enfuse on port 80. And it's also running a mail server, right, it's on port 25, and it's postfixed. So especially with Citrix Enfuse 7.5, we can look up, are there any vulnerabilities associated with this? And it's also interesting that it looks like it's only running on the unencrypted HTTP, not the encrypted version of HTTPS. And so you can kind of get an idea that there's service information available for some of that data, right? Here's a Synology Disk Station Manager 5.2 FTPT 6.2.4-255. That's very specific, right? It's very easy to see, to find out, right? Are there any vulnerabilities with this one specific version of software? And it's the same thing if we're looking at control system assets. So let's just find a random PLC and test it out. So if I go ahead and I'm just going to clear this, I'm going to go back into the Shodan interface, and then let's go, let's just go to shodan.io. Let's do a search for, remember, like when we were doing searches for like Rockwell automation. What we should see is a whole list of PLCs coming back. So let's just go ahead and grab one of these. We'll go back to our command line. We'll run smap against one of those IP addresses. And we can get this idea of what comes back. And here we can see, oh yeah, port 80 is open. So it's running a web interface. Something's running on 789. Not sure what that is. And we're also seeing Ethernet IP on 44818. So you can use it to find those ports. SMAP's a really cool little utility. Here's the instructions if you want to install it on Kali Linux, or again, you can find these from the GitHub page for SMAP. But it's real quick to get up and running. If you don't already have Go installed on Kali, you have to install that first, and then install SMAP once Go is up and running. Now, yes, SMAP is written in Go. Yeah, I mentioned there was the problem with SMAP, and there were a couple of things. One was SMAP not using a full API key or not having that option, which I do have one of those accounts, so I want to be able to use that. And then also, I think a lot of times it's not pulling out a lot of the detailed information that it can be. And so I wanted to make that also readily available. So like in this case, you can see I used my version of what I call just Shodan lookup, so, or Holcomb SMAP if you want, to run a search against an IP address. And yeah, you can see, oh yeah, port 80 is open. It tested to see, was there a banner there? No. But then, oh, here, there's port 502. And here's the banner information or the information that the PLC is responding with. And some of this you can see in SMAP too. So I'm not trying to say like they don't show this in a lot of the results as well. I just think there were some things that looked like they were missing at times. So it was just using ChatGPT to write this lookup allows you to use the API and try to provide even more detailed results around the data that Shodan finds. Right? So if it finds a port, I want as much information about it as possible. And so that's the Shodan lookup tool. It's on my GitHub repository, and there will be the link at the end of this section if you haven't visited that before, if you want to try that out. So, and I've tested on Windows. I haven't tried it on Linux. Should run on Linux as well, but it allows you to put in your API key and go to town. Now, the last thing to mention is besides Shodan's biggest competitor always, at least back in the day, was Censys. And there's a couple of other providers that have popped up. And Shodan's still, I think, considered probably the 800-pound gorilla that everybody's familiar with. Censys is probably second place. There's another provider out of China that does something very similar, and a few other competitors like Project Discovery. But when you look at Censys, the one really cool thing about Censys is it scans all 65,535 TCP ports. It's not limited to itself to a couple dozen ports like Shodan, right? Which is a big difference. Now, does Shodan catch most of what we need from an ICS OT perspective? Yeah, sure, it does. Because in ICS OT, we're not just putting ports on random we're not putting services on random ports trying to hide them, right? If I'm running Modbus in the environment, it's going to be on TCP 502. So realistically, Shodan, again, does the vast majority of the work that we need. But if you really want to get into OSINT, or if you want to really make sure you're getting all the details and you're checking all 65,535 TCP ports, then use Censys. Now, Censys also has a really strong focus. They've always had a strong focus on digital certificates. And while Shodan does index some of that data, right, Censys really digs deep when looking at it. If you find a web page that's encrypted, it takes the digital certificate and indexes every single little piece of information. But if you want to see what it looks like, and they've changed it, so it used to not be the easiest search. I think even with the new syntax, it's even worse. It's just not intuitive. Shodan's not 100% intuitive either, but I think Censys is even less so. I don't think they're doing themselves a favor here. I had created a cheat sheet for them. This goes back a long time ago. There's another one that they had put it on their website. Pretty much they just took all the content and put it on the website, and it was there until they actually changed their syntax. And I just don't really use Censys that much. But I did want to show it as we wrap up. So if we go to search.censys.io. So once we're ready to run a search, we can type in this case, like we saw on the slides, we're going to do just services. Now you can see as we start to type, it provides all of the different options, which is really cool. So, because again, it's not the easiest syntax. So if you forget something, that's okay. Because you can do, services dot, and then maybe P for, port, and then 502. So in this case, it's, show me anywhere you find an open port for 502, which we normally associate, right, with Modbus. Of course, we have a lot of hosts, like we saw with Shodan out there, that have port 502 open, but it's not actually running Modbus. That's basically the same thing that we start to see here. Again, it's kind of the same, similar data, different format. I think there's definitely advantages and disadvantages of both. Here you can actually see, we have 502 open, right? And then there's Modbus open, but look at all these other services. Is this really Modbus, or is it, something else? So that gives you a real brief look at Censys. Definitely, if something you're more interested in, dive into it. I stick with Shodan. I think Censys, again, it's just made things more complicated for users. Again, it's just my personal preference. So, again, we saw the results, and then you can dig even further deeper into it. I think this is one of those things where Censys offers a little bit more power to the user in some ways, because you can interact with and search even deeper into the database. But again, it's more work, and I can understand kind of that's because of how the database is actually set up and structured. So I get that. It's just, for the purposes of this course and for ICS OT defenders, Shodan's going to be the clear winner. So anyways, that is a big section, and that was really the main section for the course. Is really what this entire course was built around. So thank you for sitting through, listening, watching.